Welcome back to Creepy Narratives. Tonight, venture with us through dim corridors of time as we unravel tales based on true events, where solitude in one's own home becomes the backdrop for whispers from the past. Prepare yourself, for every creak and echo tells a tale. Lucy had always found solace in her family's old Carter mansion. Located in a quaint little town, the mansion stood tall, with its imposing stone walls and intricate architecture, a testament to its historical significance. When her parents had to go out of town for a weekend, Lucy didn't think twice about staying home alone. The familiar surroundings brought comfort, and she looked forward to some time alone. The first night, she settled in her favorite spot, a cozy reading nook by the window, immersed in her favorite book. The wind whistled outside, ruffling the curtains occasionally, casting gentle shadows that danced on the walls. It was serene, the kind of quiet only an old house could offer. As twilight deepened, Lucy couldn't help but sense an almost tangible shift in the mansion's ambiance. The house, which usually enveloped her in a cocoon of familial warmth, now felt charged with an electric tension. The ticking of the grandfather clock, which had kept time for countless generations, took on an unnerving rhythm. Instead of its predictable cadence, it seemed to be mimicking a heartbeat, faint at first, but growing more insistent and palpable with every ticking second. Lucy tried to shake off the growing unease. She told herself it was just the unfamiliar silence of being alone in such a vast house. Maybe she was more accustomed to the distant sounds of her parents moving about, or the distant hum of conversation. She nestled deeper into her reading nook, attempting to lose herself in the pages of her novel. But the words began to blur, her concentration hijacked by the relentless thump-thump that seemed to be seeping from the walls themselves. She looked around, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when she noticed the shadows. The soft glow from her reading lamp, which usually cast familiar patterns on the wall, was now revealing something entirely different. The shadows began to stretch, elongating in a manner that defied explanation. They twisted and contorted, gradually taking on humanoid forms that seemed to sway gently, as if dancing to a tune only they could hear. Fear gripped Lucy, but a deep-rooted curiosity propelled her from her chair. She thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a logical explanation. Perhaps a stray branch from the old oak outside was casting these eerie shadows, or maybe a window had been left ajar, letting in drafts that played tricks with the light. Determined to uncover the mystery, Lucy began her exploration. As she moved from room to room, a noticeable chill permeated the air. The once warm and welcoming corridors of Carter Mansion felt alien and foreboding. The ornate rugs underfoot felt colder. The portraits of ancestors on the walls seemed to watch her with guarded eyes, and the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards now sounded like muffled whispers. As Lucy delved further into the mansion, the sheer coldness of each chamber was becoming overwhelming. The sensation wasn't just physical. It was as if she were moving through pockets of time, with each room holding memories preserved in frost. Every breath she took was a visible testament to the unnaturally chilly atmosphere, creating a fleeting mist that danced in front of her face before vanishing. The rhythmic pulse of the clock persisted, its haunting beat guiding her steps. It felt like an anchor, tugging her towards some unseen revelation. The sprawling corridors of the mansion, once a playground of laughter and joy, now felt labyrinthine. The walls seemed closer than she remembered, echoing back her every move, magnifying her solitude. This wasn't just the stillness of an empty house. It felt like the collective weight of all the bygone eras, each bearing witness to her solitary quest. The speed of her heart became indistinguishable from the clock's constant throb, creating an eerie synchronization that heightened her senses. The play of light and shadow in the mansion became a haunting tableau. With every corner she turned, the shadows seemed to shift, almost purposefully, revealing brief glimpses of moments from the past. Murmurs, snippets of conversations long forgotten, melded with the wind's howl outside, forming an orchestra of nostalgia and mystery. Nothing, however, prepared her for the sight of the grand ballroom. This was her sanctum, a place of countless birthdays, of impromptu dances and evening soirees. But the ballroom that stood before her was a mere shadow of its former self. The opulent chandeliers, once brilliant with golden illumination, now swung ever so slightly. From their crystals emanated an ethereal blue glow, casting moving patterns on the floor below, like spirits waltzing to a silent tune. But it was the whispers that truly sent a shiver down her spine. At first they were almost indistinguishable, a soft undercurrent to the room's eerie ambiance. As Lucy ventured further into the ballroom, the whispers grew clearer, taking on an urgent tone. Names. Over and over, names were repeated in a litany, a chorus of voices from another era. Each one seemed to reach out, seeking recognition, acknowledgment. Trying to locate the source of these voices, Lucy felt a profound connection to the mansion's history. It was as if the very souls of those who had once called Carter Mansion home were reaching out, not in malice, but in a longing to be remembered. The weight of the moment bore down on Lucy, making her realize that the mansion wasn't just a structure of bricks and mortar. It was a living tapestry of memories and stories, waiting for someone to listen. Lucy had always been fond of the mansion's rich history. Even as a child, she was enchanted by the tales her grandmother would weave, tales that breathed life into every corner of Carter Mansion. The ballroom in particular was the epicenter of numerous legendary gatherings, drawing in attendees from far and wide. Swathed in luxurious drapes and glinting chandeliers, it was the very heart of social life in the town's yesteryears. People would don their best attires, gentlemen in tailored suits and ladies in opulent gowns, to sway to the mesmerizing tunes of orchestras. Within these walls, many a heart had fluttered in newfound love, countless glasses raised in joyous toasts, and souls lost in the rhythm of dance. But as with most places steeped in history, there were chapters that were often whispered, stories overshadowed by melancholy. The most haunting of these tales was that of a grand soiree one fateful winter night. What began as an evening of merriment turned to horror as an unchecked blaze consumed the ballroom, turning laughter into screams and joy into despair. Many were trapped, unable to escape the inferno, their lives extinguished in a haze of smoke and flames. With each step she took across the aged wooden floor, Lucy felt the weight of those souls. The names echoing around her weren't just whispers. They were cries of identities lost in time, yearning for recognition. Each name carried with it a story, an essence, a fragment of a life lived and lost. They weren't mere victims. They were fathers, mothers, lovers, friends, individuals who had hopes, dreams, and tales of their own. Driven by an inexplicable urge, Lucy found herself in the middle of the vast room. She took a deep breath, her heart thumping loudly against the silence. "I hear you," she began, her voice trembling slightly, echoing the raw emotion welling up within her. "I remember." It felt as if time held its breath. The oppressive cold that had weighed down on her began to lift. The room, once shrouded in shadows that played tricks on the eyes, started to regain its lost grandeur. The eerie blue lights that swayed to spectral tunes faded, giving way to the familiar brilliance of the chandeliers. The whispers, which once held a tone of sorrow, grew fainter, receding like waves pulling away from a shore. As the weekend wore on, Lucy's heart carried the weight of a bittersweet realization. Carter Mansion was not just a relic of bricks and ornate designs. It was an ever-present testament to the lives once lived. For Lucy, it was no longer just her ancestral home, but a beacon connecting her to a past that demanded respect and remembrance. The mansion had shared its most haunting secret, and in doing so, reminded Lucy of the age-old adage, to move forward, one must always honor the past. Carter Mansion wasn't just a building, it was a keeper of secrets, a home to memories that spanned generations, always ready to share its tales with those willing to listen. Rachel was a typical 17-year-old with dreams of leaving Bellington for college and bigger cities. She often shrugged off old tales as children's stories, meant to frighten or to enforce bedtime. But one weekend, with her parents away, she would come face to face with the inexplicable. The evening began innocently enough. The sun set, casting long shadows that merged with the impending night. As Rachel settled in with a movie, the first anomaly occurred. The soft whisper of wind, or so she thought, seemed to murmur her name. "Rachel?" She paused, muting the TV, trying to determine if her mind was playing tricks. Shrugging off the eerie whisper, Rachel tried to lose herself in the plot of her movie, letting the fictional world draw her away from the unsettling stillness of Hawthorn House. The movie's soundtrack filled the room, and for a few moments Rachel found comfort in the protagonist's journey. But then, just as the on-screen tension was building, an unexpected interruption pulled her back to reality. A soft thud from the floor above. It sounded distant, like a book falling off a shelf or a cushioned footstep. "Probably just the house settling," she whispered to herself, taking a deep breath. Hawthorn House was old after all, with creaky floorboards and unpredictable drafts. However, her self-assurances were short-lived. No sooner had she settled back into her film than a more deliberate sound caught her attention. It was unmistakable. A series of knocks echoing through the house's grand architecture. 3 of them, slow and methodical, each with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Rachel's heartbeat quickened. She muted the television, straining her ears, trying to pinpoint the origin of the noise. It sounded like it came from the main door, yet she knew she'd locked it. Or had she? She mentally retraced her steps, trying to remember if she'd bolted the entrance securely. Doubt began to creep into her thoughts. Feeling vulnerable, she thought of Clara, her best friend since childhood. Clara, who lived just a few blocks away, would often recount tales of her own old house's quirks and would know what to say to dispel Rachel's growing fear. Reaching for her phone, she dialed Clara's number, anticipating her friend's comforting voice. But something was wrong. As the dial tone started, her screen flickered unnaturally. Then, in a moment that defied explanation, her fully charged phone died, leaving Rachel in an even deeper silence than before. The familiar blue light of the device went out, plunging her into semi-darkness, with only the faint glow from the paused movie offering any illumination. Outside, it was as if nature itself had conspired to heighten the atmosphere. The ambient noises of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of trees, seemed to recede, replaced by an overwhelming quiet. It felt as if Hawthorn House had become a vacuum, drawing in all sounds and leaving behind a pressing silence. Every creak, every faint groan of the house's structure was amplified in this void, turning them into ghostly whispers. Rachel felt trapped, surrounded by the weight of the house's history, the countless stories it held, and the unseen eyes that might be watching. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to summon the courage to investigate the source of the knocks, and wondering if she truly was alone. With her heart pounding and every instinct urging caution, Rachel began her search through Hawthorn House. The familiar rooms now felt foreign, their shadows distorted by the pale moonlight that streamed through the windows. Each step she took on the old wooden floorboards was deliberate, trying to minimize the noise, even though it felt as if the very walls were eavesdropping on her movements. Starting with the living room, she examined every nook and cranny. The couch cushions remained undisturbed, and the bookshelf stood as she had last seen it, filled with family memories and old tales. A soft breeze from an open window made the curtains dance, but closing it did little to dispel the mounting tension. Next, she moved to the kitchen. The silverware lay untouched, and the ticking of the old wall clock seemed unnaturally loud, each second stretching out, prolonging her unease. A single glass sat on the counter, its contents undisturbed, the water inside perfectly still, mirroring Rachel's attempt at holding her breath. But it wasn't just the silence or the stillness that bothered her. As she progressed through each room, she felt an intangible shift in the atmosphere. The air grew thick, charged with a mix of dread and anticipation. It felt as if the house was holding its breath, waiting, watching. An inexplicable cold began to seep through the walls and floor, chilling Rachel to her bones and making her pull her sweater tighter around her, hoping its warmth might offer some defense against the unseen. Then, breaking through the oppressive silence, came the soft, haunting strains of a lullaby. It was distant, as if carried on the wind, yet unmistakably close. Its melody, although sweet, was tinged with a deep melancholy, a warmth counterbalanced by a profound sorrow. The notes seemed to weave a story, a tale of lost love, of yearning, and of memories long buried. Unable to resist its pull, Rachel followed the music, its allure guiding her footsteps. The sound led her towards the back of the house, past closed doors and darkened hallways, drawing her ever closer. The world around her seemed to blur, with only the lullaby piercing the thickening atmosphere. She soon found herself standing before the door to her parents' study, a room she was seldom allowed to enter and hardly knew. The rich wooden door, carved with intricate patterns, seemed to vibrate gently with the music's resonance. Taking a deep breath and summoning every ounce of courage she had, Rachel turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was bathed in a dim light, an old desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. And there, at the far end of the room, near an open window with the curtains rustling softly, stood an old-fashioned gramophone, its horn directing the melancholic tune into the night. But what caught Rachel's eye and held her gaze was a single rocking chair, moving gently back and forth as if recently vacated. Beside it, a small, old toy, a wooden cradle, rocked in tandem with the chair, completing the tableau. The realization hit Rachel. This was the origin of the lullaby, a memory, perhaps, of a time long past, replaying in the heart of Hawthorn House. She felt the weight of countless stories pressing in on her, each vying for her attention, each desperate to be remembered. The room was bathed in a glow from the streetlights outside. Among the antique furniture and dusty books, one thing stood out: an old photograph of a young girl, around Rachel's age, with strikingly familiar eyes. Eyes filled with a haunting familiarity that tugged at the edges of Rachel's memory. The lullaby's intensity grew, its notes enveloping Rachel, cocooning her in an eerie embrace. The melody seemed to plead, each note echoing with a deep, mournful yearning. It felt as if the song was trying to communicate, to bridge a gap between worlds. As Rachel stood rooted in place, the boundaries between reality and the ethereal felt paper-thin, making her question her very senses. Suddenly, a strong, unexpected gust of wind burst through the room. Papers from the desk lifted into the air, swirling in chaotic patterns before settling haphazardly on the floor. The gust seemed to have a life of its own, like a tormented soul passing through. Amidst the scattered documents, a single-framed photograph was knocked off the desk, landing face down with a soft thud that echoed in the unnerving silence that followed. Drawn to it, Rachel hesitated for a moment before bending down to pick it up. Turning the photograph over, her breath caught in her throat. It depicted a young woman, her eyes eerily similar to Rachel's own, but filled with a deep sorrow. Written on the back in a delicate, flowing script was the inscription, "To my dear Amelia, may you find peace beyond the veil." Memories flooded back, of late-night stories whispered by candlelight, tales passed down through the generations. Amelia, a distant relative of Rachel's, had been a subject of family folklore. The story went that she had vanished without a trace one bleak night. The last memory anyone had of her was her voice, singing a haunting lullaby, a song she had composed for a child she had tragically lost, a child she had never been able to hold. Rachel's hands trembled as she held the photograph, the weight of the realization pressing down on her. Was this lullaby a message from Amelia? Was the past reaching out, demanding to be acknowledged? The atmosphere grew even more oppressive, and Rachel felt a tightening in her chest. Was she merely caught in the throes of an overactive imagination, or was Hawthorn House revealing its buried secrets? As the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, Hawthorn House seemed to exhale, releasing the tensions of the night. The shadows that had danced on the walls receded, replaced by the soft, comforting glow of morning light. The haunting refrain of the lullaby, which had echoed endlessly through the corridors, gradually faded, replaced by the familiar chirping of birds outside. The coldness that had gripped Rachel's very soul began to lift, replaced by the warm embrace of a new day. The house, with all its history and mysteries, seemed to revert to its usual state, a home, filled with memories but no longer echoing with the ghostly remnants of the night before. When her parents' car pulled into the driveway, Rachel was torn between relief and a deep sense of unease. How would they react to her tale? Would they dismiss it as the fantasies of an overactive imagination, or had they too experienced the enigmatic presence of Amelia as she recounted the events, detailing every moment, from the inexplicable coldness to the echoing lullaby? She watched her parents closely. Their faces, initially filled with concern, shifted to expressions of understanding. They exchanged empathetic glances and knowing nods, a silent communication Rachel couldn't quite decipher. Her mother, taking Rachel's hand in hers, whispered, "Hawthorn House has many stories, dear. Some we've shared, and others we've chosen to keep silent. It seems Amelia chose you to share her story with." To an outsider, it might be easy to dismiss Rachel's experience as mere hallucinations brought on by the solitude of a night alone. Perhaps it was the creaking of an old house, or the tricks the mind plays in the quiet of the night. But to those who had lived in and around Bellington, particularly at Hawthorn House, such explanations seemed too simplistic. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a repository of memories, of lives lived and lost, of stories waiting to be told. The past didn't lie dormant, tucked away in the pages of history books. It was palpable, a living, breathing entity that every so often reached out, seeking acknowledgment, seeking a listener. And so, on certain still nights, when the world outside quiets down, one might hear the soft strains of a lullaby, a bridge spanning the gulf between the present and the past, a poignant reminder that some stories, some souls, refuse to be forgotten. Some might say it was a trick of the mind, the loneliness of being home alone. But in the heart of Bellington, at the Hawthorn House, the past isn't merely history. It's a living entity, seeking acknowledgment, a voice yearning to be heard, and sometimes, on quiet nights, a lullaby that bridges the divide between now and then. Josh, a college student, had returned to his childhood home, Anderson Cottage, for the summer break. A rustic house, perched at the edge of the woods, it had always been filled with warm memories of family gatherings and childhood games. This weekend, however, his parents and younger sister had gone to visit some relatives, leaving Josh alone in the echoing quiet of the family abode. On the initial evening of solitude, Josh found solace in the cozy confines of the living room. He sprawled out on the familiar old couch, a bowl of freshly popped popcorn by his side. Every crunch was a testament to his newfound freedom. No one was there to chide him about the volume of the TV or his choice of late-night movie binge. The soft glow of the screen cast flickering shadows around the room, accompanying the gentle hum of crickets and the rustle of the trees outside. Anderson Cottage had always been a haven, surrounded by the embrace of dense woods. The wind's gentle whispers through the leaves had been a lullaby to him since childhood. It brought back memories of countless nights cuddled up with a blanket, lost in stories told on the TV, while nature played its symphony outside. As the evening deepened, however, the comforting ambiance began to subtly change. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a slight shift in the rhythm of the wind, a soft murmur that seemed out of place. Dismissing the initial whispers as a figment of his tired mind, or perhaps the distant chatter of a late-night radio show from a neighbor's house, Josh turned up the TV volume, attempting to drown out the distraction. But even as he delved further into his chosen movie's plot, the noises persisted, becoming clearer, more distinct. They no longer felt external. Instead, they seemed to emanate from within the very walls of the cottage, growing in intensity with each passing hour. By the time the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, the gentle rustle of trees had been overshadowed by these mysterious sounds. The whispers, once faint and dismissive, now took on an urgency, echoing through the once comforting expanse of Anderson Cottage. Along with them, the occasional creak of wooden floorboards broke the silence, adding to the growing unease. The layout of the cottage, which Josh knew like the back of his hand, became a maze of shadows and sounds. He could trace the movement of the whispers, starting from the attic, making their way down the staircase, lingering in the hallway, and finally permeating the very room he sat in. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, making the living room feel even smaller and more constricting. With every creak, every murmured word he couldn't quite catch, Josh's initial dismissiveness turned into apprehension. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Could there be an intruder? Or perhaps some old piping or wiring playing tricks on him? Hoping to dispel his growing fears, Josh decided to brave the journey through the house, searching for the source of these eerie disturbances. He couldn't shake off the feeling that the old cottage, with all its stories and memories, was trying to communicate something that had waited for the silence of a solitary night to make itself known. Josh's heart raced, his pulse echoing louder in his ears than the drone of the film on screen. Making a quick decision, he pressed the pause button. The living room instantly became a void, absent of all noise, except for those undeniable whispers that now stood out more prominently. Gone was the distraction of the film, leaving him surrounded by nothing but the aged wooden walls of Anderson Cottage and the unnerving murmurs they seemed to conceal. Josh swallowed hard, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He squinted into the shadows, every fiber of his being urging him to just restart the film and drown out the unsettling noises. But he needed to know. "Hello?" he ventured hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, as though fearful of intruding on the spectral conversation. "Is someone there?" The haunting murmurs continued, undisturbed by his presence, almost mocking in their persistence. For a brief moment, the wind outside responded, causing the frail window panes to rattle violently, as if in resonance with his own internal turmoil. His gaze settled on the attic door. It stood slightly ajar, an inky blackness beyond, beckoning him. As he moved closer, the indistinct chatter grew clearer, sounding almost like the low hum of a distant crowd. Josh hesitated at the foot of the staircase leading upwards. The air was thick with expectancy, and each step on the old, creaky wooden stairs felt like a commitment, a promise to confront whatever lay beyond. The attic was dimly lit, a stray beam of moonlight filtering through a small window illuminating patches of the room. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of the whispers. And then he saw it, an old radio set, its design reminiscent of an era long gone. It seemed so alien amidst the dusty boxes of family keepsakes and heirlooms. Taking cautious steps toward the radio, he noticed its vintage design and wondered how such a relic found its way into their attic. But what sent chills down his spine was the undeniable fact that these whispers, these ghostly conversations, were emanating from this very device. Confused, Josh reached out, expecting to find it warm from use. Instead, his fingers met cold metal. Further inspection revealed it wasn't connected to any power source. There were no batteries, no cord, nothing to explain the voices it projected. His mind raced. Was this some sort of prank? Had someone planted the radio there to spook him? But no rational explanation seemed to fit. The whispers persisted, their tone growing more fervent, more desperate, as though the spirits tied to the radio yearned to convey a message, trapped in an endless loop of their own making. Gulping down his fear, Josh leaned closer, trying to discern words, a phrase, anything that might provide clarity. He was now not just a spectator, but an intruder, eavesdropping on a conversation from another time, another realm, trapped within the confines of an old, unplugged radio set. Deeply disturbed, Josh decided he couldn't let this mystery remain buried. He embarked on a quest for answers, spending hours at the local library poring over archived newspapers and town records from the 1950s, trying to piece together the story behind the radio's haunting transmissions. He came across an article from 1957 detailing how the small town had been abuzz about Tom, their beloved radio host. Tom's voice was a beacon of comfort in those days, his evening broadcasts a routine people looked forward to. He would share news, play music, and often spin yarns of local legends. But what caught Josh's eye was the mention of a particular stormy night when, in the middle of sharing a heartwarming story, Tom's voice was abruptly replaced by static. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no trace of Tom was ever found, leaving the town in mournful speculation. The dusty articles painted a picture of a time when the radio was the heart of communication, its frequencies connecting the community. And somehow, Anderson Cottage was now home to that very connection, a link to a long-lost voice and its tragic story. Sleepless nights followed as Josh kept vigil, hoping for the radio to activate again. And as the witching hour approached, the atmosphere would change, tangible, thick with anticipation. The whispers, initially indistinct, would crescendo to coherent pleas, especially as dawn approached. It was during one of these nights that he heard it clearly, a voice wrought with desperation. "Find me." The plea was raw, filled with a pain that transcended decades, reaching out from the annals of history, imploring Josh for answers, for closure. When morning came and golden hues of dawn filled Anderson Cottage, the spectral broadcasts would always come to a halt, the radio returning to its dormant state. But by then, Josh's resolve was ironclad. He was no longer just a curious teenager. He had become the torchbearer of a tale that spanned generations, dedicated to unraveling the fate of the lost radio host. Anderson Cottage was no longer just a residence. It was a portal, a reminder that history was not a static entity, but a living, breathing force, reverberating through time, eager to share its stories with those willing to tune in. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the echoes of the past with Creepy Narratives. Remember, when you're alone and the world falls silent, sometimes history itself yearns to be heard. Until next time, listen closely, for every shadow has its story,